Traumatic brain injury, or TBI, is a serious problem in the United States. Every year, nearly 1.7 million people in the U.S. suffer a traumatic brain injury from an accident or trauma. Traumatic brain injury is one of the leading causes of permanent disabilities in our country. If you or a family member or a loved one have suffered a brain injury that was caused by the fault of someone else, you may need a lawyer with experience in handling head injury cases. With us today is attorney David Farnball, a personal injury lawyer from the Sweeney Law Firm in Fort Wayne, Indiana. David's going to share with us what's special about head injury cases and why you need someone with expertise in that. David, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
David, I'm sure most of us have heard about cases where someone's in a head-on collision, they're in a coma for a long time, but are there cases where people suffer brain injury and have long-term effects where they've only lost consciousness for a short period of time?
I think one of the big misconceptions about brain injuries is the notion that you have to have some sort of a severe head trauma with a brain bleed, or you have to go into a coma in order to have permanent brain damage, and that's certainly not the case. We see frequently in our practice situations where one suffers a relatively modest blow to the head and they don't have any sort of a brain bleed or hemorrhage that shows up on an imaging study, and yet they can have a permanent brain injury. So you can have a permanent brain injury without loss of consciousness or without any sort of a brain hemorrhage.
Now, in those cases where someone doesn't have a brain bleed or a subdural hematoma that's picked up on an X-ray or an MRI, how can a brain injury be diagnosed?
Actually, most brain injuries are not diagnosed through conventional imaging studies like X-rays and MRIs. The most common way that a brain injury is diagnosed is through a referral of the patient to a neuropsychologist who conducts a battery of tests. Those tests usually last about a half a day, and they're known as neuropsychological tests, and they are designed to pick up or diagnose brain injuries.
What are some symptoms or problems someone could have if they've had a mild to moderate traumatic brain injury?
Well, there are a number of symptoms that a patient will experience if you've had a brain injury. One of the most common symptoms is what we call post-traumatic amnesia, where they'll have little or no memory of a traumatic event. Another common symptom is difficulty with concentration, or difficulty with memory, or agitation, personality changes. So there's any number of symptoms that a patient can experience after a brain injury.
Are there specific brain injury treatment programs and support groups for people who have had a traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, there are specific brain injury treatment centers located throughout the United States. In Indiana, we have a brain injury association that is a support group and an information source for families who have suffered a brain injury. Locally, there are support groups in the Fort Wayne area that work with families who have suffered a brain injury.
Your law firm has handled a number of these type of cases over the years. What are some of the challenges when you're presenting these cases to an insurance company or a jury?
Well, I think one of the most significant challenges with brain injury cases is what we've discussed before, which is normally in these cases there won't be any sort of an obvious hemorrhage or what we call a subdural hematoma that shows up on an X-ray or an MRI. So if you don't see any sort of a brain bleed on an MRI, then what you have to rely on are neuropsychological testing to prove that a person suffered a brain injury. And the other thing that we have to rely on to prove a brain injury is testimony from a person's family members or their co-workers who present testimony on how the person, their personality and their mental functioning has been altered after an accident or a brain injury.
Now, David, what advice can you offer someone who suffered a traumatic brain injury because of someone else or at the fault of someone else?
Well, I think the most important piece of advice I can give a family who's had a family member that suffered a traumatic brain injury in an accident and is contemplating a legal case is to find an attorney who has specialized knowledge and training in brain injuries. These are cases that involve calling a number of different doctors to testify and involve some pretty specialized knowledge regarding brain injury. So if you get an attorney who hasn't handled a brain injury case before, it's going to be difficult for that attorney to present the case properly.
David, thanks. That's really helpful information. We really appreciate you taking the time today to discuss traumatic brain injuries.
It was a pleasure to be here today.